Okay, class. Now we're getting ready to talk about the ureters and the bladder. The ureters and the bladder. Okay, essentially, coming from the kidney, let's look at that. Essentially coming from the kidney on the gross anatomy picture, you have the ureters. And what the ureters do are come down, here's the ureter, and go into the urinary bladder. As a matter of fact, let's see if I can pull up Renal 1. Okay, let's look at that. So, in other words, what happens, let's go back to gross anatomy. The ureters come down and travel and go to the urinary bladder. So that's where we are. We're talking about the ureters. Okay. They're slender tubes that convey urine to the kidneys. So let's come down again. Get to here, get to the picture I had. They are slender tubes that convey urine from the kidneys to the bladder. The ureters enter the bladder at the base through the posterior wall. This closes their distal end as the bladder pressure increases. So you don't want to have reflux of urine. You don't want to have reflux, and what the ureters do is kind of go up in the wall of the bladder. So when the bladder gets full, it collapses the tube a little bit. When the bladder gets full, it collapses the tube a little bit based upon how it enters into the bladder. Okay? You don't want to reflux urine back up. Okay? The ureters have a tri-layered wall, a transitional epithelium. Remember, transitional epithelium stretches. Smooth muscle muscularis, and a fibrous connective tissue adventitia on the outside. Ureters actually propel urine. They do kind of a peristalsis, which means they squeeze and then the next area squeezes. You say, why do that? Because you got gravity. Not really. If you're lying down or you're doing a little exercise, you're standing on your head, you still want urine to go into the bladder. See what I'm saying? So you can't depend on gravity. You cannot depend on gravity. So ureters, using this smooth muscle, propel the urine using a peristaltic, almost like the intestines, to kind of squeeze that urine down. Okay? Now we're to the bladder. Okay, this is the bladder. A smooth, collapsible muscular sac that stores urine. It lies retroperitoneal on the pelvic floor. So it's underneath the peritoneum. It's underneath the peritoneum. Okay? Males have a prostate gland that surrounds it. Look at that. Males have a prostate gland. Females is anterior to the vagina. Anterior to the vagina in the vaginal opening. Okay? In the vaginal opening. So, the trigon of the bladder, this triangular shaped thing, is at the back of the bladder, and the triangle is formed by the opening of the two ureters and the opening into the urethra. That's the trigon. Okay? Clinically important because infections generally persist in that region. That's generally where. Okay? Let's go further. The bladder wall has 3 layers. It too has the transitional epithelium because it stretches, and that epithelium is for organs that stretch. Of muscular layer, now the muscular layer, which is smooth muscle, the fancy word for it is the detrusor muscle. So the detrusor muscle is the fancy word for that particular muscle, the detrusor muscle. Okay, so that's what you're looking at there, that detrusor muscle. Okay, and a fibrous adventitia on the outside. Okay, the bladder is distendable and collapses when empty. Okay, as urine accumulates, the bladder expands without significant rise in pressure because it does a stretch relaxation. Remember, smooth muscle could do that. Remember we talked about that? Smooth muscle can do that. Stress relaxation. Okay. So here is a picture of the urinary bladder of the male going through, and see the male, here's the bladder, and now I'm getting into really, I should say, the urethra. The urethra, that's the organ that you urinate out of. So here's the urethra. See, in the males it's going through the prostate. And then it's a long urethra because it's going the length of the penis. In females, it's a short urethra. That's why females can get more bladder infections, because bacteria can ascend this short opening. Males, it's rare to get a bladder infection. As a matter of fact, if they do, a heavy, detailed investigation needs to occur, because the bacteria should not be able to walk all the way up, particularly with urine rinsing down. See? All right. So the urethra is a muscular tube, drains urine from the bladder, conveys it to the outside of the body. The urethra, the sphincters keep the, okay, so let's talk about the sphincters. You have an internal urethral sphincter about right here. And that sphincter is composed of smooth muscle. Then you have an external sphincter, which is at the pelvic floor, that is skeletal muscle. So the internal urethral sphincter is under control of the autonomic nervous system. The external urethral sphincter is under control of the somatic motor, the skeletal muscle nervous system. So this is the one that gives you the ability to hold your urine, gives you continence, so that you don't urinate when you don't want to. This one here is under involuntary control. Okay? So the internal involuntary sphincter at the bladder urethra junction, external voluntary one at that pelvic floor. Okay? So the female urethra is tightly bound to the anterior vaginal wall. Its external opening lies anterior to the vaginal opening. Okay? The male urethra has three regions. It has three regions. It has a prostatic, a membranous, and a penile. Prostatic, membranous, and penile. Prostatic, membranous, and penile. Okay. So we go further. Here it is again, looking at it. All right. Now we're to what we call micturition. Micturition is a fancy name for urination. Just a fancy name for urination. And we're looking at how micturition occurs, which would be the action of emptying the bladder. Okay, distension of the bladder initiates spinal reflexes that stimulate contraction of the external urethral sphincter and inhibit. So let me just go to this picture here. Basically, to make it, and you can read on it, as urine starts to enter into the bladder, it causes the bladder to want to, it causes the bladder to distend. Stretch receptors in the bladder say that urine is coming in, and once it gets to a certain amount, then impulses, sensory impulses, will go to the sacral area of the spinal cord. When it does that, signals will also go up through the spinal cord, into the pontine region here, okay? And what will happen is that then a reflex signal will come down and tell the bladder to contract. Now, let's think about it. The bladder has the parasympathetic going to it and the sympathetic. The parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Okay, let me explain. The parasympathetic nervous system comes from the craniosacral region. So these would be parasympathetics in the sacral region. The sympathetic comes from the thoracolumbar region. Parasympathetic activity tells the bladder to release urine because it's a rest and recluse. Sympathetic says no. So the parasympathetic sending out acetylcholine. Now let's go back to that stuff. The parasympathetic sending out acetylcholine will tell the bladder to contract and the internal urethral sphincter to relax. So you would urinate on yourself. But you voluntarily don't want to, so you hold tight the skeletal muscles in the pelvic floor, levator ani muscles and others. Now, the signal going to the sympathetic, which means the stress signal, fight or flight, sends norepinephrine down, and norepinephrine causes the bladder to relax, that muscle, and which is the detrusor, and the internal urethral sphincter to contract. So sympathetic says don't urinate, parasympathetic says do. Sympathetic says don't. Now, as the bladder starts to get fuller and fuller, it sends a signal. And you have this micturition center and the pontine center. Then what will happen is it's sending a signal down through the sacral area and saying, hey, urinate, urinate, urinate. Okay? But the skeletal muscle is saying, if you don't want to, don't urinate. Now, there comes a time when you can't hold it anymore. So you do have voluntary control up here in the cortex over when you're going to urinate and so forth. Okay? Now, I'm going to put a video in, a video so you can understand it better. But the key to this is this. The sympathetic says don't urinate, and the parasympathetic says do. Now, that's really the take-home point. And in order to really clear the bladder out, you do what we call a modified Valsalva. That means you force air against a closed glottis, like in respiratory, which means that you bear down. And that bearing down will push down on the intestines and everything, which ultimately would push on the dome of the bladder to facilitate the process. So when you urinate, not only is the autonomic, but also you're bearing down a little bit to try to get that urine out of there. Try to get that urine out of there. So that kind of gives you an idea. And like I said, I'm going to put a video in. They'll kind of talk about micturition, and you can kind of see in the video form. All right. We'll go from there then. Thank you.